Welcome. My name is Tony Russo. I'm the editor of Funeral Service Insider for Kates-Boylston, and I want to introduce you today to Hayden Burrus. He is the principal actuary at perpetualcareadequacy.com, and he'll be presenting a webinar for Kates-Boylston on May 2nd that will go over making sure you have the right kind of perpetual care program and thinking about what that means. Today, we're going to give a little bit of a teaser of that, and I wanted to ask you, Hayden, welcome, a kind of a pointed question. We're running a story about a municipal cemetery that recently closed, and it closed because it didn't have the maintenance funds, and it didn't have the ability to push the tax burden anymore. And so they just had to give up having a cemetery. How common is that, and how avoidable?
It's totally avoidable. As for how common it is, I'd say it's fairly common also for medium to smaller size municipalities. The issue is money needs to be set aside now as people are getting buried for that later point in time when inventory might be depleted and the motivation of current taxpayers or current living people that can pay into the fund, wanes because they don't have any connection to the cemetery. So money needs to be set aside now. That's why it's avoidable, and that's the kind of study I help with.
And when you talk in the May in the webinar, what are some of the things that people should be looking for? What should they come prepared to hear? And, how should they prepare themselves to, go forward after the webinar? What do you think they'll get out of it?
Well, the webinar, there's kind of two parts to it in terms of the education of it. One is to give an outline. Hopefully you all appreciate, my entire audience will appreciate that it is important. That's why they're attending the webinar. It's important to set aside money. And this will give them a preliminary idea, an outline form, a 30,000-foot form of what you need to consider when figuring out how much money you need to set aside in total and maybe every year while your cemetery is actively having burials and actively gaining revenue. The second part is I often am inserting stories of my experiences with a variety of clients over the year and what they have seen and how we handled that situation. And that might turn a light bulb off in some of my clients. I have a similar situation, maybe I can handle it this way, or turn a light bulb on in terms of this is something to consider with regard to long-term planning.
Well, I think that's important because it is a kind of a personalized thing. I mean, there are general rules, but every cemetery is so different, and the decisions that they make on the ground can be kind of malleable because of, falling demand. Do you want to add a columbarium? Do you want to add a scattering garden? And all of these are finding ways to look to drive current revenue. But in the rush to drive current revenue, it's important not to forget that you're going to need to cut the grass. I think you're the one who told me you're going to need to cut the grass 100 years from now. Were you saying the cost of cutting the grass?
Yeah, you're going to need to cut the grass forever. One stat that I pull up, here's a little preview, is a cost today, say a $1,000 monthly cost of cutting the grass. In 100 years, just with ordinary inflation, the factor to multiply that by to consider 100 years of inflation is 23. $1,000 a month cost is a $23,000 a month cost in 100 years.
That's insane. And you can't, it's not possible to sell that much scattering garden space 100 years from now.
Right.
And as people are turning to even cemeteries that are slowing down as kind of public places, it's also important, especially if you have your name on it, but also for your legacy as a cemetery owner, to be able to have this space for people to come and contemplate, even if it's no longer an active cemetery. What do you think? Go ahead. What do you think is the difficulty that people seem to have these cemetery closures? Because I'm seeing them more and more recently. There are economic troubles and people who are complaining that the grass isn't getting cut and going out and doing it themselves. Families are taking care of their own cemeteries. How does someone get that far down the rabbit hole before they realize that they've not saved enough? Like, when can you know that? Is that something possible to know and adjust for?
It's knowable many decades in advance. It's knowable that you are heading down an unsustainable path. And that can be true even if cash flow is fine, adequate, and maybe even more than adequate today. It can still be unsustainable because you need to be funding the cemetery's maintenance costs not from revenue, but from money set aside and invested when you go forward and revenue drops to zero. That's the thing that everybody needs to remember. Revenue will drop to zero, so you need money set aside.
That's fantastic. And that's really all I have for you in this preview section, unless you have something else for me. Is there something you wanted to say and didn't get a chance to, or a question I should have asked and it didn't occur to me to ask it?
I look forward to sharing more during the webinar.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so very much for your time.